Alright, so this is kind of a different angle for me. Usually I don't do stuff with just my hands in the picture, but this is a little bit easier to kind of get my point across. So a few things I've always talked about when working on Onan carburetors. This is what the intake manifold and the carburetor assembly looks like. So some of the problems that you have are the fuel pump inside this, and let me get a flathead screwdriver. I'll take this apart on camera. So sometimes you have the diaphragm inside this fuel pump gets dried out, and I always say I rarely ever replace parts on these because it's true. I have a whole bunch of carburetors that look just like this, all gummy and dirty, and they all work perfectly fine as long as you know what you're doing. So there's a whole bunch of parts inside here. There's a diaphragm, there's a spring with a little plastic piece. I highly recommend when you take them apart, have a clean parts bin like this that you can put the parts in. But as I take these two screws out of the fuel pump, and if you look at the ports on the fuel pump, this top one usually is not used. It doesn't even have a hole in it, as you can see. Sometimes you get them and they have a little rubber cap on here. Doesn't really matter. This is the one that the fuel comes into from the fuel tank, and this is your pulse line, which goes down to the little nipple underneath the air cleaner on the front of the motor. So that is actually what's causing that pump to go based on the pulse pressure of the engine. So I'm going to crack this open. All right. So this is the pump body or the valve body. This is a gasket on the carburetor itself, and this one might still be okay. Yep, perfectly fine. So even though the gasket looks cruddy and there's a little bit of corrosion here on the carburetor, that will still work perfectly fine. So put that in your parts bin, and I'm going to put the carburetor down for a minute so I can take the pump apart. Now you can see this is the pump plate. Sometimes these little reed valves, they either get bent out, or sometimes you'll find them that these little metal pieces are broken off. If these are broken off, the pump's not going to work very well. Now if I can crack this apart again, and you got to be careful because there's a spring inside here. Sometimes you can use a razor blade to pop it apart. Well, this one doesn't want to come apart. Let me grab a razor blade real quick. Alright, so when you're doing this with a razor blade, obviously try not to stick it in your hand. I've stuck razor blades in the palm of my hand before and had to clean it up and basically put glue on my hand. Alright, so you just stick it very carefully in the corner and you twist it to get the pump to pry apart. Now what you're going to see underneath this pulse plate, ooh, this one's pretty bad. See, there's a lot of corrosion in here in the corners of this. Again, this doesn't really matter because those sections of the pump don't do anything. However, you know, you'll want to clean it up before you put it on. Now, on this pump plate itself, way up here in the top corner, if you can see it right at the front of the screwdriver, there's a tiny little hole there. That has to be clear because what that does is actually allows the air to go in and out like a bellows from behind the rubber diaphragm in this. So that hole has to be clear. And where's my hang tag? Right here. So I always talk about hang tag wire. This is what I'm talking about. This is a hang tag. This is hang tag wire. What you want to do is stick it in that little tiny hole and push it through. It should come out the other side of the carburetor. This one doesn't, so this one's plugged. So you want to get this in that little tiny hole, and you should be able to push it out. You'll see it come out the front of the carburetor when you get it cleaned through. I think this hole's on an angle, so sometimes you got to wiggle it around to get it at the right angle. But you got to get it to go through that hole. So right now this one's completely plugged. Oh, there it goes. So this is what you should have. Hang tag wire going all the way through the pump plate, coming out the front side of it. Again, it may not be the greatest on camera, but you have to make sure that hole is clear. Otherwise, there's not a good chance for this pump to work ever. So there's the front plate. Again, this will get cleaned up before I put it back on. This is the pump itself and the rubber diaphragm that I'm always talking about. This plastic piece has to go on the diaphragm with a spring, and that goes into this little notch in the center. So the spring goes in that little recess, and that's what holds it in place inside the pump. So you can take these two pieces out. If these are missing, your pump's not going to work either. Then what you're going to have is a rubber diaphragm and another gasket on here. Rubber diaphragm and the gasket, these you can pull apart. So this rubber diaphragm, again, I've never had to replace one. Typically what you can do is either take some 10W30 or 530 motor oil or some automatic transmission fluid, which works really good, and just soak this thing in a plastic bag in ATF overnight. Work it all into this thing to get it nice and supple again, to make sure that this is going to work properly, because this is what actually causes the gas to pump in and out of the carburetor. And then this gasket that goes behind it, this actually might be the wrong gasket. I'm not 100% certain, but I think this might be the wrong gasket in there as well. I think the one that goes behind here is supposed to be open in the middle completely, so that's probably why this carburetor wasn't working well. In addition to that, I think this is the wrong gasket. I'll have to double check, but. And then this is your fuel pump plate. These things used to be about 90 bucks if you could find them. Now you can get them for like 25, 30 bucks on eBay. They're okay to replace them. Again, I keep 4 or 5 of these from every carburetor I take apart just to make sure I have a spare one in the case that I need it. But that's your pump plate. So once you get all that stuff apart, carburetor's pretty simple. The way it works, the pump plate goes on the front here, the gas comes in the side, the diaphragm pumps the fuel from the tank in through this hole, which then puts it into the bowl in the carburetor. And let's take the top of the carburetor off, and I can show you what that looks like inside. This isn't really the right screwdriver for this. Let me get another screwdriver, hang on. And I'm going to tell you, I was never formally trained to do this. I just kind of figured it out as time went on, because out of necessity, if anybody's ever owned an Onan, you're going to have issues with this thing over time. So the crappy gas that we have now, that's why you have all that corrosion in the pump plate that was on this thing. So you take these 4 screws out of the top of the carburetor, and they should come out pretty easily. Again, any carburetor I get, I buy spares, even if they're missing stuff. I buy them off eBay so I can have parts. So you want to make sure all these screws come out. And the top of the carburetor should come off. Sometimes you might have to work the gasket to get it off, like this one is stuck to the valve body. So if you just kind of wiggle the gasket back and forth, and because this was one of my carburetors off of an 18 horse, I had already put a brass float in this carburetor. So this, I believe, is a DD13. It is. This is a DD13 off of my BGMS out of my Sears. So this is the top of the carburetor with the float. There's a couple tricks with these when you put the brass floats in. A lot of people say there's supposed to be a spring on here to help the carburetor float better. I never put them in. I think I only have one of them, and I never use them, and the reason being, when you put these floats on, if you have an issue with it flooding too much and you adjust it to a point where it doesn't flood and then it doesn't get enough gas, you can actually take these 2 pontoons and bend them opposite each other. So one of them is a little bit higher than the other one. You literally just tweak them until they're about a 1/16 of an inch difference in height. And when you do that, you don't have to use that helper spring. So you'll see none of my carburetors have the helper spring on here. It's just, I don't think it's really needed, even though they tell you you need it. And if you ask the experts, quote unquote, they'll tell you they need it. I'm a bit of a fix it in the field type guy. All my stuff works because I know how to work on it. To get the float out, you take out this pin very carefully. And then when you lift the float out, the needle is going to come out with it. So there's your needle. Sometimes you get needles that have a rubber tip on them, like this time. Sometimes you get them that don't have a rubber tip on them. I don't think it really matters that much. I'm assuming sometimes if you buy the Chinese rebuild kits that have the rubber tip, the rubber's going to fall off, because I've had that happen with a couple of Briggs carburetors. But in this case, I think this one's probably original. Then you have your carburetor gasket that comes off the top. Usually the top of the carburetors don't ever get gummed up. You might have a little corrosion in here. If you take the little sprayer on a carburetor cleaner bottle, spray in this hole here, spray up through the jet, spray in this tiny hole here, and spray through here, and you should have carb cleaner coming out of all the orifices on the carburetor. You can also spray it down through this hole, which is your overflow hole, and it should come out in the bottom of the carburetor. So that's how to clean the top of this. That's very simple. The top of this never really gets messed up. Now, a couple things about cleaning the base of the carburetor. So you can see in the base of the carburetor, and this is a different one, this is where your fuel comes in from the fuel pump. It comes in this little hole here from the pump. and comes out the top of the carburetor, and that's what fills the bowl. This goes through the needle into the bowl. So what I typically do if I'm suspecting that the pump isn't working, I'll just take the top of the carburetor off and crank the motor over and see if gas squirts out of this hole. If gas does squirt out of this hole, you know your pump is working, and then typically you have a problem with your float. So in this particular case, again, top of the carburetor's off. Clean all this area out with carb cleaner and maybe a little bit of a wire brush, a very soft one. I use a brass brush or a nylon one sometimes. Clean out through here. Then in the top of the carburetor, you have this little tiny hole here. This is basically what runs your main circuit. So this hole on this side of the carburetor, this is your main circuit. This needle that comes out of here should have an O-ring on it. If it doesn't have an O-ring, this thing is going to leak gas really bad and it's going to run poorly. So the screw that comes out of this hole should have an O-ring on it. You can buy replacement screws off of eBay. If it's a brass screw, I wouldn't recommend getting it because I've seen them where the tip breaks off, and sometimes the tip of the taper of the screw is actually different than the factory one. So I always try to reuse the original screw as long as it's still good. And then this is your idle screw. Usually I think this has a spring on it on the inside. And I haven't rebuilt this carburetor. This is one I bought off of eBay a while back. So there should be a spring on this screw. Yeah, and there is. So this is your idle circuit. This one, it looks like somebody bottomed it out too far because the tip of the screw is all bent. So I'm going to have to replace that with a different one. But this is your idle circuit on the front of the carburetor facing the front of the motor. This is your main circuit, or your high-speed screw, whatever you want to call it, that allows the fuel in when it's running. So I'm going to take this out. Now again, going back to cleaning this, you can spray gas down this little tiny hole here. It should come out the bottom. And there's a couple of holes in this little channel. There's one on this side. When you spray gas or spray carb clean in the hole on this side of it, it should come out this little brass piece in the center of the carburetor. And there's 4 holes on here. Now this is a DD11. DD11s have this little piece in the center of it. The DD13 doesn't. It just has a little nozzle that drips out from this side of the carburetor. So, but when you spray down the hole on this side of the carburetor, gas should, or the cleaner should come out of this brass nozzle. What really screws these carburetors up, if I turn this thing over, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see it on the camera, but if you look where the idle circuit is here, if you flip the carburetor upside down, down here in the throat of the carburetor is going to be a tiny hole. When the butterfly is closed, when you're looking at it from upside down, when the butterfly is closed, there's a tiny hole in the throat of this carburetor. That is your idle air bleed. So that needs to get cleaned out. Usually you can spray carb clean down this hole and you'll see it squirt out from that hole. Now here's the trick. When you open the butterfly up, below the butterfly, right below the idle air circuit, there's another tiny little hole. And again, I doubt you're going to be able to see it in the video, but below the idle air circuit, there's another tiny little hole that goes down in that carburetor. That's your idle air circuit. Now what happens is, because that hole is so tiny, you get this pasty corrosion in here. It'll actually close off that hole, and that makes it so that you have to run the choke on the carburetor when it's running. Now that little idle air screw actually, or that little idle air circuit hole, comes out on this side of this transfer slot over here. So what you have to do, again, go back to your hang tag wire, and you have to flip the carburetor upside down, find out where that hole is. It's on this side of the carburetor. And again, it's a tiny little hole. You have to get this hang tag wire to go in that hole, and you have to work it up and down. Now this is really tedious, and a lot of people, they don't go through the effort of doing this, and this is why most Onan carburetors don't idle for crap, and then they freak out and they say it's a piece of junk and they want to replace it with a Predator, God forbid. So you actually have to work this hang tag wire in and out, and this one's actually going in pretty easily, or is it just bending? It might be bending. But you have to work this hang tag wire in and out until it actually comes out the hole on this side of the transfer slot. That's the real key. Once you get that little bypass hole or that idle air circuit cleaned out, this thing will work properly. That's the biggest problem I see with these carburetors. And the hole isn't a straight shot through, it kind of has a jog in the middle of it. So trying to get this wire to go through can be a bit of a pain. Take your time, have some patience on it. It will be worth it. I gotta get it back in the hole there. Yeah, I know, joke, right? So work it back and forth. You'll feel it when it starts to go through eventually. This one is completely plugged. I can't get that hang tag wire to go through there. When it's clean, it should push right through. And you can't just stick it in the top here and go down, because you're never going to find the hole inside this transfer slot to make it come out the bottom, because it's a little tiny pinhole in the bottom. You could sit here all day poking this thing and you're never going to be able to find it. So you have to do it from the bottom of the carburetor. And again, there's two little tiny pinholes. The top one is the idle air circuit. The top one is the idle air screw that goes right out through this hole. And the one that's below that, above the butterfly, is the idle air circuit that you want to clean out. And again, this one is completely plugged. I can't get the wire to go through there right now, so I'm going to have to work this one. And this is basically all you do. You straighten the wire out and you kind of wiggle it up and down, and eventually you'll break through that crud and it'll come out the top. Even though they get completely clogged up, it's usually just a little bit of oxidation, so it'll usually blow right out of there. Again, this one's giving me some trouble, so I'm going to have to clean this one. But that's the idle air circuit that you need to work on. Now, when it comes to gaskets, when you put this whole thing back together, intake manifold, people talk about air leaks on the intake manifold. What they're talking about is these intake manifolds are physically two pieces of metal. So you can see the bottom half and the top half. And this little goopy thing here is actually the original gasket sealer in between the two halves of the intake manifold. Now, a lot of people will drill out these little rivets that hold the intake manifold together, take it apart, clean it. You don't have to do that. Again, I'm trying to do things in an efficient manner. What I do, clean the entire intake manifold with carburetor cleaner, take a razor blade like this, scrape all this original sealant off the two halves of the intake manifold so that it's nice and clean, clean the whole thing down so you see bare metal, and then literally take RTV silicone. I like to use copper form of gasket or gray because they're more resistant to gasoline. So I'll actually take the RTV and I will coat the entire seam on this intake manifold all the way around with about, a 1/4 inch wide bead of that stuff, and just mush it all in that seam and let it dry. The reason I do that is because you don't want an air leak in there. That will cause the carburetor to run lean on one cylinder. A lot of times it'll pop and fart and you don't really know what's going on. The intake manifold is a cause of that. So that's why people say seal the intake manifold to make sure that you don't have an air leak there. Now, the next thing, I always talk about, don't use the green intake manifold gasket. So this is a green intake manifold gasket. This is a brand new one that's been sitting on my shelf in a package for about 3 years, and I'm going to show you why now you don't want to use these gaskets. Oh no, it fell apart. These things are made out of some kind of a ceramic, kind of like header gaskets for cars. The problem with them is they're extremely brittle. What happens is when you put the intake manifold on and you torque down on them, they just crumble apart like this. This gasket is 100% useless. Never buy these gaskets. If you see them in rebuild kits, you have to buy an OEM quality one. Now, this is an OEM one out of one of my Onans. The original one actually was a metal gasket that had kind of a graphite on one side of it. These are great. A lot of times you can take these off and reuse them. You could always put some more gray sealant on there or some copper sealant and reuse these. But if you get a decent head rebuild kit, or decarbon kit actually, off of eBay, and these you can have for about $9 now. These head decarbon kits used to cost a lot of money. This is a decarbon kit. So you have a set of head gaskets. You have 2 exhaust manifold gaskets if you have the type of motor that the exhaust bolts onto. Inside here you have a large base gasket for a carburetor for the P-series motors. You have 3 valve cover gaskets because one of the valve covers actually has a plate in it with a reed valve, and that one needs 2 gaskets. Then you have your intake manifold gaskets. These are the ones that I use. These are steel backbone. They're graphite impregnated. These work really good. So use these. Don't use that green crumbly crap that you can get. And I think G Hope or Gary's Place on eBay is the only place that I've seen that sells those. I hate those gaskets. I'll never use them. So that's a little bit about how to clean the carburetor, how to seal up the intake manifold. The intake manifold gaskets that I use, this is your base gasket for your carburetor. You want to replace this. This, I believe, comes in the decarbon kit as well. So that's that kind of stuff. And then I always talk about using a sintered bronze fuel filter. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about a sintered bronze fuel filter. Inside this, it has a little tiny bronze element. They're very small fuel filters, 1/4 inch inlet and outlet on these. The fuel flows in this direction from the small end to the big end like a funnel. And basically, these work really well because they require very little suction to pull gas through them. Especially on the old Onans, if you're reusing your fuel pump parts, a lot of times they're not super strong. So you need something that requires very little pull through. Now I have had a few of these fail on me recently. There's a couple different brands that make these. Obviously, if you buy them off eBay, 99% of the time they're coming from China. I have had a couple of these that when you put them in and the hose is pulling at an extreme angle on it, it will actually pinch the inlet of this thing and close off around that sintered brass piece. So, or bronze, whatever it is. It'll actually close it off and then you won't get any fuel. So you'll be out driving your tractor around, you give it full throttle, you go for about 10 or 15 feet and then the thing starts to sputter because this will actually get clogged off. So I have started using this style. These are even cheaper. These are, I don't know, $2 or $2.99 a piece. I bought like a dozen of these from a place out in Western Mass. These work just as well as long as your fuel pump's working properly. A large area of paper around the fuel filter itself gives you a good pull of fuel going in there, and these actually work kind of like a reservoir. So once they're full, you're going to get a lot of fuel in this thing that's going to help it start better because it'll keep some of that in the fuel filter. Now, some of the other tricks I always talk about when you're doing any work on your carburetors, use clamps. Every connection between your fuel tank and your carburetor, if you have a fuel filter, put clamps on both sides of your fuel filter. That will make sure that you're not going to be sucking air through any of the joints on your fuel line, and it's going to give you the best chance to make sure that fuel pump is not working too hard. They're cheap insurance. They're a couple cents, maybe 30, 40 cents a piece at the hardware store. Definitely use these. I always keep a bunch. Even these old nasty ones, they work perfectly fine. Shoot them with some carb cleaner. You can reuse them over and over again. Now, the other thing I realized recently, there's a couple different kinds of fuel line. The Sears tractors use 1/4 inch fuel line, and this is like petrified because it's so old and the current gas that we use is really crappy. This was an actual fuel line. This probably worked perfectly fine back in the 70s and 80s. Then we started introducing ethanol-based gas, and these things are total garbage. So a couple things that happen to the fuel lines, if they're an older fuel line, what happens is the inside layer, so these are basically 2 layers of rubber with some cord wrapped in between them to give them strength so they don't pinch off and stop the flow of fuel. What will happen sometimes is that inside layer of rubber will actually disintegrate and close off the entire fuel line. And you'll go out, you'll start running your tractor, you put it up to full throttle, engage your mower deck. It's usually like 150 feet away from your garage where the thing sputters and dies. And everybody says, oh, it's because your coil got hot and you lost spark on your motor. Well, usually these things don't lose spark. The coils on them, I have about 10 Onans. I've never replaced a coil on these. While I believe they do fail, usually the condenser goes bad if you're having spark issues, or a lot of times your problem is your fuel system. The nice thing about having a see-through fuel filter, whichever one you use, if your tractor stalls when you're out somewhere, you can jump off, pop the hood, and see if your fuel filter has been sucked dry. Or, in the case if you haven't taken your fuel tank off, you'll actually sometimes fill these things up with sediment from your tank, which will clog off the fuel flow, starving the motor of gas. It'll shut off, and then what happens is when it shuts off, all that fuel flows out of the filter back to the tank and pulls all that sediment out. So sometimes if you're having issues where you're running your tractor hard after a few minutes and it stalls, jump off, quickly look at the fuel filter before it shuts off and see if it's full of sediment. If it is, pull your fuel tank off of that thing and clean it out. So that's not 100% of all of my techniques that I use. That's just a baseline of what I try to look for when I'm cleaning the carburetors, when I'm working on the intake manifolds, and I try to do this on every tractor I get. So when you get a new Onan, the first thing you want to do, obviously check and see if you have a brass filter inside of your carburetor. Or not a brass filter, but a brass float. If you do, good for you. If you don't, throw that piece of garbage foam float out and go buy a brass one. They're about 35 bucks. I buy them from a guy on eBay. His username is MJ58. They're around 30, 35 bucks, something like that. This is the best insurance you're ever going to get to make sure your Onan runs properly, these brass filters. And this one doesn't leak, which is good. There's no gas in it. Fuel filter is another thing. Make sure you have a good fuel filter. On your carburetor, make sure you're cleaning out that idle air circuit, which again is above the butterfly. Make sure all of your other circuits inside your carburetor are correct. Make sure your high-speed jet on your carburetor has the O-ring in it. Make sure your idle circuit has the spring on it. And again, the one that sticks out of the carburetor base more, it's at the back of the carburetor. This is the one is your high-speed circuit. The front one that's a little bit closer in, that's your idle air circuit. So that's the carburetor. Again, make sure you take the diaphragm out and you clean it up, rub it with some ATF or oil to get it nice and supple again. Put the pump back together, and that's going to be your best chance to make sure this thing works properly right out of the gate. Also, make sure you seal your intake. So that's the best tips I can give you for right now. I've had a lot of people asking about what do I do when I get an Onan. That's just the fuel system. There's some other things I'll talk about in another video when I have time. Right now I don't feel like doing all of them today, but I do want to take the valve covers off of another motor, show you what you need to look for inside there, check the gap on all of your valves and everything like that, change your valve cover gaskets, clean the reed valve out and things. So there's a lot of tips and tricks you can do to make sure these motors are going to run good. Thanks for watching another edition of Cranky Motorsports here on this rainy Thursday. Tomorrow's Good Friday, so if you do celebrate Easter, have a great Easter, and I will talk to you guys again soon.